Welcome to this afternoon's session. We're going to be running it logistically as follows. Wolfgang will kick off with a presentation of about 15 minutes, and then we'll open for Q&A straight after his presentation, directed to his presentation, because Wolfgang has to leave for the airport at 16:30 precisely to get an aeroplane. And rather than wait until the end for all of the Q&A, we'll take the Q&A for him then, so he can make the airport in time. So from about 16:10 roughly, we'll then go over to the other two presenters, first Christina and then Theodore. And when they're finished with their respective presentations, we'll then open up for a more general Q&A directed primarily at their presentation, so from probably around 16:30, 16:35. So I do encourage all of you to think about questions and comments. It's often that part of a session that is the most instructive, the most rewarding for all concerned. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm fortunate to be here for the second time at a CyCon. I was here in 2015. The sunshine was on. I'm back here, the sunshine is still on, so Estonia must be the land of eternal sunshine. So, very good. So, Wolfgang Kleinwächter is almost an institution in his own right in the area of internet governance. He's been a very important policy entrepreneur in this area for at least the last 3, if not 4 decades, and it's a great honor and pleasure to have you here to address us, Wolfgang. Please.
Thank you, Lee. And thank you for having me here. You know, the right to freedom of expression, right to privacy, right of association, all these are fundamental human rights which are relevant in cyberspace. But all these rights means nothing if we live in an unstable and insecure cyberspace. So the question of this session is really to find the relationship between security and individual human rights. Does it work here? Yes. You know, I remember 15 years ago, in particular after September 11, there was a debate whether you have to pay with a loss of privacy to enhance security. So there were 2 camps. One camp said, okay, you have to give up your privacy if you want to live in a secure world. We have to control everything, and then we will have 100% security if you have 0 privacy. And the other camp argued the other way around. And this approach proved to be wrong, because you cannot buy security by giving away your privacy. Even if you give away all your privacy, nobody can guarantee that this will lead to a secure cyberspace. So that means what you have to have is the right balance between privacy and other fundamental rights, including freedom of expression, freedom of association, and security. And this was more or less is the outcome of a debate in international fora. And this was laid down in the so-called Geneva Declaration of the United Nations World Summit on the Information Society, which said to build a people-centered, inclusive, and development-oriented information society where everyone can create, access, utilize, and share information and knowledge, enabling individuals, communities, and peoples to achieve their full potential in promoting their sustainable development and improving their quality of life, premised on the purpose and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and respecting fully and upholding the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That means the information society, as it understood by the world community, is based both on the Charter of the United Nations, which guarantees security, and the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. So that means you cannot play one thing against the other, both has to go together. And this was more or less repeated in the Net Mundial Principles. This was the big multi-stakeholder conference organized by Brazil in the year 2014, the most advanced documents on internet governance principles, where also it was repeated that human rights is the basis for the information society, and security can be treated as a human rights. And again, this interrelationship was also reconfirmed on the review conference on the World Summit on the Information Society in New York in the year 2015. So what does it mean for the future? So already 4 or 5 years ago, the former president of the European Parliament, Martin Schulz, came up with an initiative and said, we have to strengthen fundamental rights. Probably we need a new charter to strengthen fundamental human rights in cyberspace. So the European Parliament was discussing not only Snowden, but also, the role of US companies. And there was a feeling in the European Parliament by some members of the Parliament that, yes, we have to strengthen fundamental rights. So that means Schulz started the process. Then a German foundation, the Zeit Foundation, entered in and created a multi-stakeholder group of 28 intellectuals, mainly from Germany, and they worked on a draft for a new European Charter for Fundamental Digital Rights, which were presented to the subcommittee of the European Parliament in December 2016, and a second draft was presented just recently to the new German government, the Minister of Justice, Madame Barley, and discussed at the Republika in Berlin. And if you want to go deeper into the text, the website is here. So the problem was, and this is the core of my talk, is, do we need really new fundamental digital rights? Yes or no? There was, in this group, there was a debate and said, okay, on the one hand, people argued, so we have already fundamental rights. We have the European Charter on Fundamental Rights from the year 2000. And we have the Human Rights Declaration, which was reaffirmed by the World Summit on the Information Society. That means we have existing rights. And others said, okay, yeah, that's right. But all these texts were written in the analog time. So that means we have to have now a digital age, and we have to see these rights in a new light, and probably we need new rights, like the right to be forgotten and others were referred, which were constituted by the European Court of Justice. So what we agreed finally was an understanding. If we want to move towards a new instrument, probably the new instrument would not be a new charter, but a framework of interpretation. Then one thing is, it's clear that the world has changed. And probably a number of these fundamental rights, which were described either in the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights from 1948 or in the European Charter on Fundamental Rights from the year 2000, has to be seen now in a new light. And insofar, the conclusion from this initiative was we need an enhanced understanding of the existing human rights in a digital world. This was the conclusion, and we also concluded that while the existing mechanism of human rights is concentrated on the relationship between the state, the government, and the individual. So we concluded that now a lot of things are done via the private sector. So, and the question is, what has the private sector, big corporations, do they have also obligations, quote unquote, to guarantee human rights? The guarantee for human rights is in the hands of governments mainly. So, but what about all these other big companies which handle our data, which enable us to enjoy our right to freedom of expression? So these were the two open questions. If we go deeper into the role of the future of discussion of fundamental rights, we need an enhanced understanding, and we need a broadening of the debate with regard to the various stakeholders. We came up with to summarize this and also to conclude, we identified in particular 3 issues which where further discussion is needed. And I think it's not a surprise that the first issue was we have to have an enhanced understanding of the right to freedom of expression. I think the debate this morning when Alex Stamos spoke about, from Facebook about the complication, how on the one hand to guarantee freedom of expression, on the other hand to do something against the pollution of our intellectual environment, against fake news and some other things. So this is a delicate issue which needs further discussion. So we have in this charter, we do not propose already a final solution, but I think this needs further discussion. Personally, I think if you compare it with the car traffic, if you clean the highway from drunken drivers, this does not interfere into the freedom to drive a car. So, and it's a delicate issue because it's extremely difficult to have the borderline where you say, okay, here freedom of expression stops. Normally, this can be decided only by independent courts on a case-by-case basis. So insofar, we are really entering here slippery territory, but we have to have a discussion so that the sensitivity of all stakeholders is growing, and you can develop a certain feeling, what is right and what is wrong. You will never settle this issue, but I think this is one issue for further discussion. The second issue, it's also not a surprise, is the right to privacy in the digital age. So we have a lot of new discussions around this. The GDPR is probably the most important new legal instrument. You know that in the Human Rights Council, the rapporteur on privacy in the digital age, Kadanaki, is proposing new instruments, including instruments against mass surveillance and things like that. So this is the second line of discussion, and the third and last line for discussion is artificial intelligence. And I think this will affect the fundamental rights fundamentally in the future. Yesterday in the Munich Security Summit, the General Petraeus, who was also the chair of the CIA, made very clear in a debate about lethal autonomous weapon systems that at the end of the command chain, there has always to be a human being which can be made accountable. And I think this is really important. If we discuss artificial intelligence, it's nearly impossible to regulate it in a classical way. So that means here also you have to look for innovative ways how to handle this, probably stumbling forward on a case-by-case basis. But I think this is an important point, that at the end of all these chains where machine to machine is communicating, you have to have a human being which is in the final control. How this can be implemented, this is not easy, but this has to be discussed. And we need more public awareness so that these issues, freedom of expression, privacy, and the future of artificial intelligence is discussed. And this is not enough because we cannot discuss these issues in isolation. There is one internet, there is one cyberspace. And we have at the moment different strings of intergovernmental negotiations where the negotiators are sitting in their silos. So we have cybersecurity, this is negotiated in the first committee of the General Assembly and in the United Nations. In the digital economy, the World Trade Organization is discussing a digital trade pact and a regulatory system for e-commerce. The human rights issues I mentioned already in the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, and artificial intelligence is discussed elsewhere. The G7 will organize a huge multi-stakeholder conference later this year in Canada under the Canadian G7 presidency, and probably the outcome from the G7 conference will be an agenda for the future of artificial intelligence. But if we have one internet, then you cannot negotiate this separately. Like privacy and security, this has to go in hand, and we have to find the balance. And the GDPR is a very good example that if you regulate one field, like privacy, this has economic consequences, this has implications for the security, and certainly you need the technology. So that means you have to have a holistic approach which brings the security, cybersecurity issues, the digital trade issues, the human rights issues, and the technology issues in a certain balance. With this, I say thank you. And if you have some questions, I have still 2 minutes for Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Wolfgang. Well, in fact, we have more than 2 minutes for Q&A. While some of you may be preparing or thinking about a possible question or comment, I might just come with something myself. I'm intrigued by the initiative that you flagged earlier on in your presentation about a European sort of high-level principles code. And I'm just wondering, is this thought of as something by Europe for Europe, or is it thought of as something which would be in conformity with the latter part of your presentation that is meant to also operate for the benefit of the wider world? That's one question.
Yeah. There was when Schulz started the initiative, there was like always, you had first enthusiasm, and then you had skepticism. Said, we have so many instruments, do we need a new charter? Schulz was also the candidate for the chancellery in Germany, and he negotiated in the coalition treaty that the German government will take this project sooner or later and will table it in the European Union. So that means the future of this initiative, whether this will be a charter, a statement, or I proposed a framework of interpretation. So this is open, but the discussion will continue. And I think the 3 main issues I have outlined, freedom of expression, privacy, and artificial intelligence, will probably drive the discussion. How far this will go, it's difficult to say. It was a German initiative, so that means I go tomorrow to Tbilisi, to the Eurotic. We have a similar session there. How many other Europeans are interested in bringing this forward remains to be seen.
Okay.
Hi. Lucas Ilves. For now, my relevant hat is I chair the Council of Europe's expert group on the human rights dimensions of artificial intelligence. So first, the advertising plug is we're working on the interpretation of the Council of Europe's human rights and how the court should interpret it on automated processing of data, free expression. So we'd love to pull you in and we have a lot of stakeholders behind the table, but we'd like to have you on board. The question I do have, though, is if I read the charter, most of the questions that are raised are addressed in a fairly strong, if particular way, by a fair bit of European law, GDPR sort of primarily among those bits, but also a number of decisions by the European Court of Justice, other bits of law that are being negotiated right now, like the privacy regulation, rules we have on the books. So do we need to have a broad discussion in Europe, or is it that we need to figure out what our message is to the rest of the world? Because it seems that we've had that debate in Europe over the last 5 years, but we don't necessarily, in the conclusions we've arrived at, share the same outlook that the rest of the world does in some of the details.
Yes and yes. So that means it's never enough discussion in Europe. So these are the circles which have this discussion, but even now in Germany with the GDPR, 80% of the German public is surprised that there's a GDPR. So that means we have to go out of the silos and to bring all this experience which have been collected in the discussion to the broader public. So it's really limited circles in the Council of Europe, in the Commission, in the Parliament, in expert circles. But you are absolutely right. While the big cyber battle in the economic field and probably also in the military field will be between China and the US. What the Europeans can bring to the table, they do not have Google or Baidu. They do not have Alibaba or Amazon. They do not have Tencent or Apple. So what the Europeans can bring to the global process is the rule of law. And insofar, the GDPR is a very good example where now, this has triggered the economic model of a lot of big corporations. Even Facebook has now big advertisements in German newspapers. Say, oh, GDPR is a good thing for good reasons. So, and I think this is the way where the Europeans can really contribute to the world. And my understanding from the plans from Mr. Katanaki is that he is looking in the Human Rights Council, if he talks about new instruments, to use the GDPR also as a source of inspiration, probably for a United Nations Convention on Data Protection. So this is open for discussion. Nobody knows. At the moment, he has different plans, but and it has to be seen, you know, how the GDPR works. But I think for me, that's only a first step where you can use special European regulation as a model for other parts of the world. And then, because Europe in this field has not such fundamental economic interests like the Americans or the Chinese, so they have also their interests, but European is seen as a, I would not say a neutral party, but so this reflects more or less a common sense and a general understanding.
Hi, Wolfgang. So I have more of a tactical question building on the last question and the eternal problem with internet governance, right? So your last slide just showed all the different silos. And for AI, for example, the OECD is also doing an initiative in addition to the GSA, et cetera, et cetera. So how do we convene as a multi-stakeholder group? How do we convene the right people in the right place, and right people meaning everybody in the right place, to have these coherent discussions instead of running around, as you know, to Brazil, and I'll see you in Tbilisi tomorrow, and those kinds of things. So how do we actually make that happen so that there's more coherence?
Yeah, this is the proposal for the so-called holistic approach. And this is difficult to plan, because you have these established communities with different cultures. The trade people are so different from the security people, and the internet governance people are so different from the human rights people. So, but if you want to have sustainable results, they have to talk to each other. Some people have proposed, okay, let's start a process like with climate change, which leads to a Paris agreement for cyberspace. As I have said, okay, like the law of the sea, which is also a very complex convention. So my proposal would be to get inspiration from the Helsinki process in Europe, where you had different baskets. The baskets were negotiated individually, but were interlinked. So that means the internet is a decentralized mechanism, so that you could have liaisons among the various silos, so that decisions in one basket are taken in the light of the experience of the other baskets. Within ICANN, I'm for more than 20 years with ICANN, we had this so-called YANA transition, where we had rather different communities, for the names community, the numbers community, the protocol community, and all they negotiated individually, but came together in a so-called cross-constituency working groups, where they informed what they decided in their field of competence. So that means the proposal is not to create a new world conference on the internet and to move towards a world convention on cyberspace, but to have a decentralized systems where the various negotiation strings are interlinked via liaisons or representatives or whatsoever. So, but that this could lead to, I call it a multi-layer, multiplayer mechanism on enhanced communication and cooperation. So you have to give the baby a name. So, but this, and I repeat, if you continue in isolated ways, you will not have sustainable results. Thank you.
Good. Thanks very much again, Wolfgang. So Wolfgang mentioned briefly the role of private gatekeepers and private platforms, and that was quite a nice bridge over to the theme of the next presentation by Christina. So Christina, without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And thank you. I'm very, very pleased to be here, and I look forward to the discussion today. I am going to talk about de facto content regulation by social media platforms in the context of the fight against terrorism and violent extremism, looking into issues raised from a human rights perspective, with particular focus on the right to freedom of opinion and expression and interlinked rights such as the right to participate in public debates. Now, I think it has been well established in the past years that internet intermediaries who provide a platform for and curate online content play an extremely important role in facilitating the public's access to information, communication, including in facilitating discourse on issues of public interest. And this has revolutionized the way individuals, governments, groups, a wide variety of actors communicate, and also how public debates are conducted. It also resulted in the spaces where individuals exercise their free speech, as well as seek information to allow them to form opinions, being increasingly controlled by private entities. And for this reason, the argument that some online platforms have become the digital age equivalent of public squares has been gaining traction. And there is an argument to make that due to their reach, use, and level of interactivity, some of these platforms, at least to some extent, do play a public interest role. And why is that? Of course, studies show that people have been increasingly getting their news from social media. Social media platforms have been instrumental in disseminating information about human rights violations and abuses, about political developments, about humanitarian crises, and so on. And in certain countries and provinces, some of these social media platforms are actually so dominant that to at least part of the population, they represent the internet itself. And especially as in these cases, offline information frequently flows in a restricted manner, this platform constitute the main source of information, and that includes information that is of public interest. Now, if we look at how social media platforms regulate their functioning, they work on the basis of standards that are pre-established and that are unilaterally imposed. And that provides them with a quasi-normative power. They're also the ones who, of course, execute and enforce these rules, which gives them sort of a quasi-enforcement power. And they also have this quasi-adjudicative role, and frequently require that disputes that arise with their users are settled via internal or alternative dispute mechanisms. And of course, having in mind the role that these entities or some of these entities play, the question arises whether the exercise of this private sovereignty should be subject to some form of checks and balances to avoid arbitrary and abusive use of power. But of course, while the terms of service and community standards that the functioning of these platforms is based on should be in line with the laws of the states where they operate, which in itself can be a very big challenge for companies. The companies do not have any formal human rights responsibilities. Arguably, under the UN guiding principles on business and human rights, they do have a responsibility to respect human rights and to ensure remedy in case they abuse them. But of course, this is soft law. It's a resolution of the Human Rights Council. It is not binding, and not unimportantly, it is not something that has been formally agreed with companies. And I do not suggest that companies are insensitive to issues related to freedom of expression, and many of them are actually quite sensitive to them. But what I'm trying to say is that there are many underlying issues. And this is reflected, among others, in the fact that community standards frequently go beyond what human rights standards allow and what states could enact as binding rules. For example, a number of platforms censored nudity in general because they wish to facilitate the creation of a space that fits their business model, that is more minor-friendly or family-friendly. This is something that states could not do. However, as we are well aware, there has been increasing pressure on platforms and internet intermediaries to monitor and to police content generated and disseminated by users on behalf of the states in the content of the fight against terrorism and violent extremism. And this is a trend that is very much driven by the use of ICTs by terrorist groups as a tool for recruitment, financing, planning, and so on. And many states have been considering sanctions and fines to be imposed on online platforms who they think are not doing enough to counter this phenomenon. And because of that, platforms have, of course, taken a number of individual and concerted measures, which did not provide for a comprehensive solution. And it is not really something surprising, considering that one of the very important challenges that is faced by companies who are addressing terrorist and violent extremist content is that there is no universally agreed definition of either. States define both terrorism and violent extremism in their domestic legislation, and there are very significant discrepancies between the different approaches that states take. And in addition, there's been a tendency in past years to criminalize conduct that used to be in the pre-criminal space before, such as glorification of terrorism, apology of terrorism, praise and justification of terrorism. And similar concerns go actually for violent extremism as well. Many states don't even focus on countering violent extremism, but countering extremism and radicalization, and disassociate the concept from violence. This has actually triggered a lot of criticism on part of human rights bodies, both from international organizations like the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the UN or the Special Rapporteur, as well as NGOs. Because under some of these definitions, there is a threat that almost any kind of views that deviate from social norms accepted by the majority may be suppressed as measure, and the measures may actually target thought and belief and opinion rather than actual conduct. Then again, some companies respond to these developments by developing their own definitions, which is something that Facebook has done. And Facebook has recently published a blog post where they define terrorist organizations as any non-governmental organization that engages in premeditated acts of violence against persons or property to intimidate a civilian population, government, or international organization in order to achieve a political, religious, or ideological aim. It is very commendable, of course, that a company who must be, at least in part, struggling with the expectations on them to deal with terrorist and violent extremist content. At the same time, it also raises some questions and some red flags, because if one reads this definition, it can read as including in the category of terrorist organizations any non-state armed group that is involved in a non-international armed conflict with a state, which is, of course, problematic. And in addition to issues related to, in addition, it's actually linked to issues related to definitions. Enforcing all these different standards in different jurisdictions comes with very real challenges, especially for those companies that operate in many countries or that operate quasi-worldwide. The other aspect that I would like to raise, in addition to the substantive criteria that is used by platform to deal with content that may be criminal in nature or that they are expected to censor and remove, are the procedures that they employ when it comes to assessing content. And this is generally, when it comes to terrorism and violent extremism, this is an exercise that requires a rather sophisticated legal analysis. we unfortunately have insufficient and incomprehensive information on how platforms make such determinations, including on what are the circumstances when artificial intelligence is used, what are the circumstances where there are human oversight, what are the circumstances where there is a combination of the two. Of course, the use of artificial intelligence to deal with large volumes of content is something that is encouraged by some states and the European Commission as well, so it is something that is likely to be a lot more prevalent in the future, also because there is no way to deal with horrendous volumes of content with human moderators. Now, the problem with algorithms, of course, is that they are not foolproof, and that may lead to screening that is over or under-inclusive. For example, algorithms are not necessarily well equipped to understand context, different forms of humor, may not pick up certain nuances and subtleties, and need to be trained for different languages and contexts. And what is particularly important in the context of terrorism and violent extremism, they are not necessarily very well equipped to assess intent on part of the person posting, I mean criminal intent, and also the threat level as the result of a certain post. Now, the problem is, even if we employ human expertise, that is not necessarily a silver bullet either for many reasons. Doing it right would require social media platforms to employ a very highly trained and specialized workforce. Reports that we have indicate that it is more frequently low-paid and insufficiently trained moderators that are the de facto gatekeepers of freedom of expression online. For example, reports in German media on Facebook moderators employed in Germany by a third company who do content review for Facebook allegedly have, on average, 8 seconds to decide on the legality of a certain post. Because of these shortcomings, and this is my final point, it is very important that there is due process and there are adequate safeguards in this content regulation and moderation process. And this is something that so far is largely lacking, or it is definitely not adequate. Users generally have very limited options at their disposal to receive information about processes, to challenge decisions, or to get redress, while the social media companies, the platforms, have their own challenges. First of all, the volume of content, and secondly, onerous intermediary liability frameworks imposed on them. Obligations included under laws such as the German Network Enforcement Act. They also receive very little help and guidance from public authorities. And considering all this, it is very likely that in case of doubt, platforms will err on the side of over-censoring. So I think that while there is much to be said in favor of self-regulation and in favor of regulatory restraint on part of the state, when it comes to these issues, one has to bear in mind that the human rights obligations of states include the obligation to set up a framework and to create the conditions that makes human rights compliance possible, including on part of other actors, non-state actors, that very much includes businesses. And this would definitely mean ensuring that there are effective safeguards, that the relevant rules that underpin content regulation and moderation are accessible and are foreseeable, and there is a possibility to meaningfully challenge decisions. There is an access to remedy, and there is a meaningful independent oversight. This is very much to ask, and we're extremely, extremely far from this. However, I think that if we want to safeguard freedom of expression online, these are the conditions that we need to be moving forward in the future. Thank you very much, and I look forward to questions later on.
Good. Great, thanks very much, Christina. And hopefully we will have a fairly seamless transition over to the world of PowerPoint. We do.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to thank very much Torsten and the organizers for this invitation. I have a huge challenge, which is presenting to you in 15 minutes, something that normally needs about 15 hours to explain adequately, which is law enforcement, cross-border access to data, and human rights. The big issue is that there is absolutely no doubt about the fact that law enforcement, police justice need to access data in this digital age. But the big question is how to do this in a way which will be compatible with human rights. So this will be my outline during these 15 minutes. The starting point was the USA versus Microsoft case. Although this case is dismissed today, there are some very important lessons to learn from this case. The second point in my outline will be the Cloud Act. We're a little bit lost in the clouds since its adoption. The third point would be the e-evidence proposal proposed recently by the European Commission, and I will discuss the important challenges for not only the months, but the years ahead. So let's start first with the first point. I guess you're familiar with this important case in front of the US Supreme Court, the USA versus Microsoft case. For those of you who are not familiar, let me explain it very quickly. You don't mind being Europe, I will be the United States. And the point in this case was the following. The FBI requested Microsoft the data, the emails of a suspect in a drug trafficking case. Microsoft examined this and said, well, we are sorry, we cannot give you the data because the data you're asking for are in our data center in Dublin, in Europe.
Very safe hands.
Very safe hands, exactly, with GDPR hands. And so Microsoft said, if you want, let's imagine that this is what Microsoft said, let's imagine that you were asking for a book that this guy left in Dublin. What you are supposed to do? You are supposed to go through an MLAT, Mutual Legal Assistance Treaty, so send a request to the Dublin authorities, which will go take the book and send it to you in the United States. So this was the position of Microsoft. With data, we should do exactly the same thing as for a book, send a request to the Irish authorities. But what is very interesting is that the United States government did not have at all the same approach. And this is extremely interesting, thought-provoking about the status of data today. The United States said, well, not at all. Well, both parties in this case accepted that the law, the American law on the basis of which the warrant has been issued, which is the Stored Communications Act, had no extraterritorial reach. So the US government did not question this. They said there is no extraterritorial reach to this old law drafted in 1986, well before the cloud. But the US government said there's no extraterritoriality here. Come here, Mr. Microsoft. Come in Washington, D.C., Seattle. We give you a computer, and you can access all data that you want. So the data are American. There is no extraterritorial reach. You can imagine that there is a huge problem. I drafted a study at the request of Microsoft, which was published, and you can find on my CERN page last December. And I heavily criticized this approach of the American government, because you can imagine beyond all things that every government in the world can use it. Moscow can say that all data are Russian. Pyongyang can say that all data, if they're accessible for Pyongyang, well, technically it could be more difficult, but they could be North Korea. But could we consider that the argument of Microsoft is better, and that Microsoft said that what is relevant is the place where the data are stored? Is it more relevant in a digital world? Well, in my study, I discuss also this extensively. Of course, it's not the only relevant criterion. We have plenty of other things that we must take into consideration, but it is relevant. First, technically, the data has a much greater materiality than it is often suggested. When you download your emails, in reality, what you do is that you request a specific data center somewhere in Ireland or in Tallinn or elsewhere to give you access to this. So this is very much relevant. And also legally, because after the revelation of Snowden, companies like Microsoft invested hundreds of millions of dollars in order to build data centers in places like France, for example, Germany, the Netherlands, and elsewhere, so that they will send the message that, well, what is done in Europe remains in Europe, your data will be stored in Europe, and will be protected by the GDPR and European law. And this was also the position of what became very recently, since the entry into force of the GDPR, the Data Protection Board, the European Data Protection Board, which last November said that the circumvention of existing mutual legal assistance treaties by a third country's law enforcement authority is an interference with the territorial sovereignty of an EU member state. So all this it's very interesting because, as a matter of fact, we could ask ourselves, now the case is dismissed. We were expecting the decision of the US Supreme Court in June, but the adoption of Cloud Act, I'm coming to this immediately, rendered the case moot. It was dismissed, but nonetheless, for me, Microsoft won the argument, the case, because Microsoft's argument was that American law did not have an extraterritorial effect. And so the Congress had to adopt, a few months ago in March, this bill, the Cloud Act, in order to give clearly an extraterritorial reach to the Cloud Act. So I come to the second part. What is the Cloud Act? The Cloud Act is two things. First, what we call the Microsoft Ireland fix, their solution to the Microsoft Ireland case. Please read clockwise with me the main points very quickly about Cloud Act. Well, was this a fix? Yes, surely. From the point of view of US law, it was a fix. Microsoft's argument was that the Congress needs to legislate in order to give an extraterritorial reach to American law. This was done. It was not the case before. It is clearly the case now. But of course, the solution was given only from the point of view of American law, not at all from the point of view of European law, conflict of laws, etc. The second thing in the Cloud Act is that it introduced a procedure which permits a company like Microsoft, Amazon, Google, or any other to file, in case of such a request to give what is stored in the cloud, to file a motion to quash or modify to the American judge. Very good, but no novelty. It was possible also before, absolutely no novelty here. And what is very preoccupying is that the Cloud Act provides for no obligation for the US judge to follow this, to quash or modify, even if the US judge finds that there is a conflict of laws, for example, with the European law or any other, there is absolutely no obligation to accept this petition. Why? Because the American judge could say that we have national security considerations in the United States which are absolutely preeminent, and so we must give priority to this. Even if there is a conflict of laws, it don't matter, we will not modify this warrant. So the third problem is that the problem of conflict of laws remains, and especially the huge issue is the incompatibility of such a request with the General Data Protection Regulation, especially Article 48. I could talk for hours about this, but what is very clear is that we need the European Union to come out and say that there is clearly an incompatibility with the GDPR and that we have to follow some conditions and some procedures in order to lift this incompatibility so that things will be clear. My other point is what will happen with the reactions of other states. Now, all states know that American law has clearly an extraterritorial reach. What are they going to do? Are they going to accept this? Are they going to accept that the data produced and stored in their territory will be given to the American authorities without even them knowing? Nothing at all. So what will be their reaction? This is interesting to see, and we could also make a parallel with other issues of laws, American laws, which has an extraterritorial reach. Let's think about the Iran sanctions and the whole debate and others. And finally, there is a concern about the fact that the Cloud Act does not take sufficiently into consideration interstate and reciprocity issues, which brings me to the second part of the Cloud Act. I still have some time, which provides for bilateral agreements, the possibility to conclude bilateral agreements with several governments in order to give a solution to this conflict of laws. not all governments, it's just with qualifying foreign governments, just an elite of governments, if they meet some strong American human rights requirements, and if there is no veto from the Congress, in which case, oh, the Europeans will be happy, they will finally have access to some data stored in the United States directly using the same procedure. But attention, not all data. There are very strong limitations, a very limited number of data that they could have access if there is such a bilateral agreement. But this is the novelty that there is a lift of some of the blocking features of the ECPA. Nonetheless, major questions remain, including the issue of reciprocity and human rights requirements that could be, for example, European human rights requirements. How are we going to introduce them? Are we going to be able, through these bilateral agreements, to resolve all these issues? Let me go now to e-evidence, to the European Cloud Act, presented just a month ago by the European Commission. Well, the idea is similar. Instead of going through this, through this MLAT procedure, which is very time-consuming, I cannot explain to you here, but the idea is to have a shortcut, like Cloud Act, instead of passing through international cooperation between states, to request directly Microsoft or Amazon or Google or any other to give the data to the authorities through what we call the European Production Order, an order given directly to an ISP provider. I don't have the time, unfortunately, to present you all the issues in Cloud Act, but in e-evidence, but at least very, very quickly, I would like to say that what is interesting is that, first of all, e-evidence makes a clear distinction between 4 types of data with different settings, if you want, and procedures for each one. The more the data becomes sensible, the more we have human rights and other requirements. We can use this procedure only for serious crimes, for example, not for any kind of crime. And we have also, what is very interesting, we have both a project of a regulation about all this, the European Production Order especially, but also a directive on legal representatives. We ask all companies to have a legal representative where the states will be able to address these issues. What are the futures? Very, very quickly, because I'm running out of time. Well, first of all, there is an extraterritorial reach in e-evidence. Extremely interesting. The Europeans criticized heavily the Americans for their extraterritorial reach of their law, of Cloud Act, and at the same time, their response is to introduce an extraterritorial reach in e-evidence so that they could play on the same level field, if you want, during the negotiation. Second issue, e-evidence takes very well into consideration extraterritorial reach, yes, but taking very well into consideration the protection of immunities and privileges of foreign states with the possibility to go in front of a judge. If he finds that there is any kind of problem concerning privileges and immunities in another state, he has an obligation not to cancel the order, the European Production Order. Same things, we take into consideration adequately the protection of the fundamental interests of foreign states, and this is very important, and the contrast once again to Cloud Act. And there is also, you can read this regulation of dozens of pages as always. You can see that there are very strong human rights protections. There is room for improvement, and a part of my work now is precisely to try to define what we should improve so that we will be able to meet the requirements of European law. But you will see that there is a very good quality of this. Despite this, there is a criticism of the NGOs. I will not be able to discuss it because I'm running out of time. I just have 1.5 minutes left in order to talk to you about the challenges ahead. What are the challenges ahead? Well, first of all, logically, adoption of e-evidence. It's a very good legislative package. There are things to improve. We can do it quickly. The big challenge is, when are we going to be able to adopt this? States need this e-evidence, and for me, it's a very important step towards the conclusion of an agreement with the United States and with other states. So are we going to be able to adopt e-evidence before the end of the current mandate of the European Parliament, especially, which means till March, because we have elections in June. In March, they will enter into legislative mode, the European Parliament. This is a big question. It could be good to adopt e-evidence as soon as possible. Second challenge is that we need to start negotiating an agreement, a data sharing agreement with the United States. The United States already started doing this with the UK. There is this myth about this data sharing agreement between the United States and the UK that nobody has seen. If somebody has it here, please give it to me. I would like to read it. But the major issue is now is that we have the evidence. The EU clearly affirmed its competence in this field. So logically speaking, we should have an agreement between the United States and the EU, and this should resolve the issue. Big problem, the United States are not at all willing to conclude an agreement with the European Union, and this is why Cloud Act only speaks about the possibility to conclude bilateral agreements with governments, not with international organizations. Why? Because they are fearful, the United States, of the human rights protection in some of the EU member states, especially the ones of the East, and this is the big problem. So what are we going to have? Are we going to have a framework agreement between the United States and the EU and agreements also with member states? This is a very huge issue on which I work actually. And finally, I promise, these agreements, whatever, either EU, US, or bilateral with states, will definitely need to address adequately all the human rights issues in order to pass the control of the European courts, and especially Luxembourg, but also Strasbourg. We have seen what happened with Safe Harbor. We have seen what happened with the recent PNR agreement with Canada. There is absolutely no doubt about the fact that the Parliament, the European Parliament, will submit this case, this agreement, to the European Court, so it's absolutely necessary to be able to have enough human rights protections in order to pass this test. Thank you very much.
Good. Thanks very much, Theodore. Thanks very much, Christina. We've got now 18 minutes, roughly, to have a discussion, questions. While some of you are thinking, I see one hand up already. I've got a very sort of quick question for you, Theodore. When you were talking, I was intrigued by the omission, presumably because of lack of time, of reference to the Cybercrime Convention. And I'm just wondering what sort of role that might play, because interestingly, that's the Council of Europe instrument that has been ratified by the USA. It's quite extraordinary. And I just wondered, could that be some sort of bridging normative framework in this way ahead with respect to e-evidence?
Yeah, this is extremely interesting. Of course, I cannot enter into details. We're negotiating right now an additional protocol to the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which precisely has for us an object to address the issue of e-evidence, let's say evidence in the cloud. It's interesting to read the European Impact Assessment Study, 250 pages, but there is a part about the fact why this is not contradictory with other existing instruments or with the project of the Budapest Convention. I think that basically the short answer to your question, because there are many answers, but the short answer is that within the Budapest Convention we'll never be able to go as far away. With the Budapest Convention we'll pose some very basic rules. Let's not forget that we have more than 50 states, newcomers, a lot of African states are Japan is part of the Budapest Convention, Australia, and several African states are coming into the Budapest Convention. And of course, we will not be able, taking into consideration this situation, to go as far. So it's an important project, but certainly not as ambitious as what these bilateral agreements want to do.
Okay, good. Gentleman down the back first.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all three speakers. Now we just have two here, for your wonderful contributions. My name is Kubo Mačák. I teach international law at the University of Exeter in the UK. I have a question for Dr. Huszti Orbán, if I may. You started your talk by saying that social media platforms now have these quasi-normative, quasi-judicial, quasi-executive roles. So let's drop the quasi, and if we talk about normative, judicial, executive, what are we talking about? We're talking about states. And so is the consequence of the argument that social media platforms are slowly becoming quasi-states nowadays? Now, this question is sometimes posed to their representatives, and for example, Mark Zuckerberg, when he was asked this very question, he said, oh, no, Facebook is not a state. Facebook is a community. But then it's a strange community, isn't it? One that doesn't give its members any say in how they are governed. So maybe, you know, Professor Kleinwächter was talking about internet governance. Maybe we need to talk about social media governance. And I wonder if that's the consequence of the argument that you're making, so that members of these social media platforms must be given some say in how they are governed. It's not to say that it hasn't been tried. Facebook tried it and failed in 2009, but I wonder what your thoughts are on that. Are we moving in that direction, or is it an impasse completely? Thank you.
Thank you. It's a very interesting question. Thank you very much. I would not say, of course, that social media platforms are becoming states, but I fully agree with you that in certain respects, they are taking over tasks that have been traditionally associated with states. And at least in that respect, I feel that they should be taking up more responsibility that is akin to the responsibilities that states have when it comes to, for example, guaranteeing freedom of expression. States are not very well placed to guarantee freedom of expression on Facebook and Twitter, on most of these platforms at this point. And I agree that ideally there should be some sort of, if they are a community, obviously you should consult the community, and your rules and your governance should be a result of that community's wishes. Considering that the community, for example, of Facebook or many of these social media platforms is very, very big, it's much bigger than the community forming most countries, of course this would be an extremely difficult issue, which is why, in a way for me, the easier but not really option is to go via the existing obligations of states to ensure that within their jurisdiction, human rights of people are respected even by third parties. And that, the complications of that, of course, come from the fact that when it comes to these platforms, it is very difficult to think in terms of individual countries. And one country may legislate and it may have limited effects, it may even become disruptive. So ideally, of course, you would need something that is binding in a way as a state could legislate, but that goes beyond the national level. I think that's not particularly likely to happen anytime soon, but this is how I would see probably a meaningful solution to these problems.
Okay. Yes.
Hello. My name is Asaf Luban from Yale Law School. One of the last comments that Wolfgang made in his presentation was the need to break the silos that exists across this space. And I want to argue that your papers have a similar siloing in the sense that we ran an event at the Information Society Project at Yale Law School titled Extraterritorial Enforcement and the Information Society. And we argued that MLAT people are not talking enough with access to data people and with data control people, in the sense that the same conflict of laws problems arise when you want to access data stored by an intermediary or when you want to censor data stored by an intermediary, be it in Germany to a data stored by Facebook in the US, or be it Microsoft wanting to access data stored by an Irish. And so the problem isn't that we need to look at a Cloud Act. The problem is that we need to start thinking about a private international law treaty that deals with conflict of laws in data and intermediaries. And so it's not a solution that is state-by-state basis through domestic extraterritorial laws, but rather through a private international law treaty. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts about such a proposal.
Very quickly, as far as my presentation is concerned, if we have a treaty between the EU and the US, this will immediately resolve the conflict of law issues. You can call it as you want. Is it a private international law or human rights or whatever, data sharing? Call it as you wish. The issue is that if we have a treaty, this will immediately resolve the problem, because on the basis of Article 48, 49 of the GDPR, there will be clearly no more conflict of laws, because this will be done on the basis of a treaty. So, solution.
Good.
As I indicated before, I do think that a real solution would be at the international level, because everything else sort of, at least in the, with respect to the issues that I've been addressing, everything else would just provide for fragmented and probably temporary solutions.
Yeah, if by international, I'm sorry, you meant universal, because a treaty between the EU and the US is an international treaty, of course.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, but the international, go back to the question about the Budapest Convention Protocol. This is exactly what we're trying to do there, although it's not really universal yet. It will not have Russia or China, but still it's a very multilateral initiative. But the problem is that if we want to go far in this cooperation of data sharing, we cannot do this at this stage with everybody, because you really need to have very good human rights guarantees from both sides.
Okay.
Jeff Kossup with the U.S. Naval Academy. I really enjoyed your presentation about extremism and terrorists on social media and how the platforms are dealing with it. And the one thing that I'm curious about, you hear anecdotal reports from law enforcement saying that it's actually an incredibly valuable source of information for them when there's this public communication, there's not the issues of warrants, it's out there in the open. So has there been any research from when the platforms start to crack down on this content as to what impact it has on law enforcement and really overall the cost benefit when there is more restriction of the public-facing content?
I am not aware of any such studies that have been conducted. If anyone here is working on anything related, I would be extremely interested. Because one of the issues that that is raised when you look into censoring content, I obviously do understand that there is certain content that needs to be removed. Everything that is incitement to hatred and violence that comes with that triggers a certain threat level that a crime may be committed, obviously, it should be removed. But then, when one looks at, again, anecdotal evidence of the kind of posts that are being removed, I think much of that actually would be protected under international human rights law, under freedom of expression, because with freedom of expression, you can publish a lot of questionable things. Unless they hit a certain threshold, they should be left there. One thing that came to mind when you asked your question, and again, anecdotal evidence, from law enforcement, that when overeager platforms censor content that may be of terrorist nature, actually they're not really helping law enforcement and they're not really helping prosecutions, because then evidence is not properly contained and it cannot be used in a court setting anymore. So in that respect, it's not necessarily something very effective and something very useful. But I take your suggestion to this, as to the study, because I think that would be extremely useful for everyone who's interested in this debate.
Good.
Yeah.
So more empirical work is necessary. Good, and then the gentleman here.
Hello, my name is Przemysław Roguski. I teach international law at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland, and my question goes to Professor Christakis with regard to one specific issue that you briefly touched upon, namely Article 48 GDPR, which says that any transfer of data on the basis of a decision of a public authority has to be only on the basis of MLAT or other international agreement. Now, my question would be, or I would be interested to hear your views on how this would play out in a future possible case. I mean, let's imagine Microsoft 2. We have an EU person. Now the US wants the data of this EU person, requires Microsoft or Google or whoever to hand it out. And now we have Article 48. And so what would the European reaction on that be? I mean, what's the toolbox apart from the legal text that we can use to block that, and what would be the consequences? I would be interested in hearing it. Thank you.
Great question. We could discuss endlessly about it. I think that the first step is to ask this question not to me, but to the Microsoft people or to Google, Amazon, and all the others. Are they going to challenge a new warrant or not? The second point is it could be eventually useful to have the EU come out very clearly and say that such a thing will be incompatible with Article 48, because you know they have also Article 49, There is some ambiguity, and this ambiguity, unfortunately for me, was not erased by the amicus curiae that the EU Commission submitted to the US Supreme Court in the Microsoft Ireland case. They remained voluntarily ambiguous in discussing Article 48, 49, a little bit disturbing for a researcher like me who seeks some kind of clarity on these issues. Probably it could be good to have some guidance before answering your question from the EU. If we have such a guidance, I think that things are very simple. Because if we request, for example, I don't know, Microsoft or Amazon Cloud or Google, if we request them data which are stored in Europe, and this is contrary to the GDPR, you know that we have these huge sanctions in the GDPR, so they will be exposed to all these sanctions, which could go up to 4% of annual overall return. So I think that there are other issues to discuss, of course, but these are probably the steps in order to give an answer to your question.
Thanks very much. Interesting when you say you'd like some guidance, because it brings us back in terms of circle drawing to Wolfgang's call for a framework of interpretation. And that could be one of many, many elements of such a framework of interpretation. So we're not quite at 1700, but I also have a plane to catch at 1805. So I do note that the adrenaline levels are starting to rise within me. And it would be, I think, probably now quite appropriate that we start to bring this to a close. Would you like to say something to conclude, Torsten?
All right. Yeah, thank you on behalf of the organizers. It's a great pleasure to have all of you here on our panel and to let us have some insights and some very detailed opinion on that cutting-edge topics. And as an expression of our grateful thank you for being here, I want to hand over some little presents and hope to stay with us for the rest of the conference, at least the two of you. And okay, thank you, and please applause for the panelists and the moderator.